All right, people, everyone, welcome. Come in. Today we are discussing if you came for the Maryland child support changes in 2025 webinar, you are in the right place. What parents don't know but need to know. I welcome you here tonight. All right, and keeping my time in mind, I wanted to start to again by telling everyone welcome to this presentation tonight, my monthly webinar on Maryland child support changes in 2025. My goal today is to give information to make this a little easier to understand and also something that you can talk about with your co-parent or anyone who may be interested in learning a little more about child support. So I want to start off by telling you a little bit about me if you don't know. My name is Sharice Williams, and I'm the principal attorney and owner of the law office of Sharice L. Williams. And I'm licensed in Maryland, D.C. I do divorce, but I do a collaborative divorce process. I also can do the process using collaborative for prenuptial, postnuptial. I do custody, child support, all of the things under the umbrella. I also do enforcement proceedings. I do wills and power of attorney. So if you are interested in learning more about my firm, I'll have that contact information. You can see on this screen here, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. And so, of course, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to view it at a later date. There is a chat section. I'm going to speak throughout most of this presentation. And so if you have a question, you can submit it within the chat. Or if some people have submitted questions in advance, which we have a couple, then I'll be able to answer those at the end. So I'm going to wait until the end to answer questions just to make sure that I get out the information that I have designed for tonight. And so the main thing I wanted to just emphasize to everyone is I love doing these webinars, but these are for educational purposes only. This is not considered legal advice. It doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. So if you do have those specific questions about your case, you can certainly give my office a call. My phone number is 240-499-8569. So now that I've gotten some of the housekeeping and lighter things underway, let's go a little deeper about why we are here tonight. So let's just talk about, I want to acknowledge first that child support is one of those emotional topics. For many people, it brings up stress, fear, anxiety, anger. So my goal is not to just explain legal concepts, but to make the conversation feel a little more understandable and more human. So let's talk about child support and why it exists in the first place. I'm not going to go into the long history of child support, but overall, from a legal standpoint, it's not designed to punish a parent. So a lot of people feel like they're being punished, being asked to pay child support. Child support was not designed to reward the other parent. It exists because after a separation, you're still financially responsible for raising your child. That does not disappear, and it's designed to allow for a child to be maintained across two households. So the key idea is just that the child support is about helping make sure that that child is supported, and both households, the child can have potentially access to both parents. Each situation unique in that way, but the child neither nonetheless has there's a financial support that is allocated. So this matters because a lot of parents understandably come into this conversation and they have a lot of emotional pain from the relationship. So child support is not supposed to be a tool that's used against one parent, and it's supposed to be to address the financial realities of parenting your child. So just a little brief explanation about why it exists in the first place. So let's talk about some of the realities of child support. um, so with child support, generally speaking, there is a guideline worksheet that is used in divorce cases. So these are required in most divorce cases when there are minor children. And when looking at the worksheet, you're gonna again have parents who feel like this just isn't fair, that they have to um, go and have money allocated out of their now new home to the child. So when parents, sometime again, their emotions come in, and it'll spill over into those financial discussions, right? And so the law is designed to remove some of that emotion. And so the calculator is basically kind of emotionless because there's set things that you have to put into the calculator. And a number is going to come out based on the income qualifications along with the expenses of the child. So, what does child support actually, what determines child support? So, again, we talked about this Maryland Child Support Guideline. And so, the guideline, there's worksheets that are designed. So, when we're looking at that, it's not arbitrary, it's based on a structure that the law designed. And so, that final support number depends on several parts of the family situation. So, again, we're looking at income, and then we'll define income a little more because income can come from your business, income can come from your job, income can come from if you get paid from some passive method like stocks and bonds. And so it could be part-time, full-time. There are many different definitions of income. And even for some people, if they're getting money consistently from another party, it could be a parent or someone, and that can be argued to be income. So trying sometime if you don't have a formal job where you're actually getting a paycheck, it may not necessarily mean that you don't have income. And so the structure of your family now is also important, meaning how many minor children are one or both parties obligated to pay for. So it's very important to understand that these factors, when you're talking about child support, it's not just the number itself. And so you're also going to look at the kids' expenses. So they, of course, they have healthcare expenses. They're going to have childcare expenses depending on their age. So those things are part of the calculation. So depending on which worksheet you're using, those there are those basic dynamics that have to be put into the calculator. So now we're going to talk about how the parenting time matters when we're thinking of child support. So in Maryland, we utilize a 92 overnight threshold rule to determine which guideline to use. So if a parent has less than 92 overnights, not daytime, we're talking overnights, per year, then you're going to utilize the primary physical custody worksheet. Okay. And so that is the name, kind of the defined worksheet that you will, the lawyer, or if you are doing it yourself, or the court, if the court is involved and you don't have lawyers, that is the worksheet that you will be provided. The other worksheet, if both parents have over 92 overnights, then you're going to utilize what's called a shared physical custody worksheet. And so that worksheet is also already the worksheet. When I say worksheet, it's an actual form that's been designed. The court has software that's utilized. If a lawyer is doing it for you, we have software where the calculator is already built in. You can also find this online on the Child Support Maryland Child Support worksheet. I'm sorry, Maryland Child Support. There's a website specifically that you can look and kind of put numbers in for yourself. But that overnight threshold can change the support calculation. So depending on what your schedule that you settle on, or if the court orders, and it just depends on what's done for first. So if you don't have a formal custody schedule and you go to court, depending on what is actually happening at that time with your child can be argued. But if you do go to court and you're negotiating custody, then depending on what the outcome is. Now, one major thing is you should not, courts frown upon it, using the amount of time just to ask for more overnights, specifically just to avoid more child support. Because if it's not in the kid's best interest, you shouldn't be doing it, as the thought process. So you don't want to leverage that. But there are ways to negotiate so that You make sure if you want a few extra overnights to get you over that 92 threshold. It happens often, but you have to make sure you're still doing this based on the best interest of the child. If you know you can't handle the child, or if you don't really have the ability to have over 92 nights, it's best not to ask for it. But everyone can do, what best serves them. But that's just something to think about, because that's the threshold that's used for child support. Now, let's get to the what happened in as of October 1st, 2025. So in Maryland, as of that date, the law changed where there is now a consideration for children that parents who have children living in multiple households. So if a parent has, and it's called the multifamily adjustment. So courts recognize that parents are already financially supporting a child in their home. They may use that as something to consider in making that calculation. So there are factors that go into that you have to meet in order for the court to consider it. So one being that the child must be living in that home. And this is 25% of the year. So it's similar to the 92, if you want to look at numbers, 92 overnights a year. And this could be a biological, or if you adopted a child. Um, and there's this assumption that you have a duty to take care of that child if they live in your home. And also that if you're not already subject to an order, so if there's already a child support order, then it's already taken care of. But this is just for those kids that are living in the home that there's no order. Because if there's already an order, that's a different conversation. So this is for people who have kids sometime after the fact or already in the home, but they're not under a court order. But the court can reject this if there's evidence to show that it's unjust or inappropriate. So, yes, it is something now that can be considered, because other jurisdictions, meaning around us and in this country, have already utilized this, DC being one of them. So Maryland is just kind of catching up to this. So this is effective as of October 1st, 2025. And then if you already have an order, it does not impact those orders. It's only going to impact if there's a modification filed. So just keep that in mind. Right now, you can't just act on it. You actually have to someone has to file for a modification. So now we're going to talk about income transparency. So when we're looking at child support cases, one of the biggest things that is very important is that you're transparent. So both parents in a divorce, so I'll just stick to divorce because that's the easiest way to talk about child support in a broader context. So you're both obligated to fill out income disclosure forms, and those forms are financial forms you fill out, and you're going to be putting pretty much your expenses as well as what income you've received, and also debts that you have essentially on that sheet. So that's going to be one form to determine your financial status. And then you're also going to complete this child support worksheet that I discussed with you. So you'll determine based on what your overnight situation is, which worksheet's the most appropriate. So the court looks at those things. They also can look at your tax returns. They also can look at pay stubs, all of those things, bank statements, all of it could be relevant. But if you have a situation where it's not just one parent's responsibility to disclose, both parents have to disclose. But if evidence is present about income inaccuracies, a party may ask the court to impute income to the other parent. So essentially, that can come from, let's say, one parent has an education, because education is relevant based on education can be relevant to what job you have and how much you make. So looking at the totality of that parent's situation, if one parent is just working a job that has nothing to do with their education or abilities, or if they had a prior job and now all of a sudden they don't and their income has dropped dramatically, then that can be argued that their income needs to be imputed based on that. So the court could basically say that your income is going to be what it should be, not what you report. So that is something, if that happens to you and you truly don't have the income, let's say you did get a job where you're making less, now you're going to be have a support that is higher than the money that you're actually currently bringing in. So you don't want to get caught in a situation like that. So transparency and being and disclosing what you actually are making is your best option up front so that the court can have an accurate depiction of what it is that you're making. And again, that goes on both sides. So if you don't do these things, you're always going to think about your case could take longer, it's going to cost you more. If you're represented, that's where people fight over disclosures. You have to subpoena bank records, bring in more witnesses. So the complicating factors what could drive up the costs. And essentially, if you're paying everyone else, you're not going to be taking care of your child. So think about those things when you're going into a case and the conversation about child support. Because even though it's not easy and you don't always want to disclose everything you're making, if you make it harder, in the end, you may end up spending more anyway. So now we're going to talk about why parents often end up back in court. So child support cases sometimes end up returning to court years later. And so they think, oh, one little change, this thing can be decided over and over again. So, but in actuality, if something has changed, it needs to be a material change. That could be something, an income change that generally speaking, it should be 20 to 25% change in income before a major motion for modification. If your case is through the Office of Child Support Enforcement, they usually won't even review a case unless it's been open for at least 3 years. Also, if no payments are made, that's typically when a case may come back for contempt on that child support. So if you lose a job and you can't make the payments, it is a good idea to notify someone. And also, if you're again through the Office of Child Support Enforcement, you can notify them. But it is still your obligation to pay what your current amount is until you get a modification. But if you file the modification, depending on when you file it, then you can pause, like at least once you get to court and you argue, okay, my modification, I don't have the ability to pay. The court will trace it back to when you filed. So it is important to keep that in mind and not wait, because then you build up all the months that you should have been paying this amount and you don't have the money. So for people who are losing income or lost a job, and you owe child support as an ongoing obligation, you may be someone who does need to either try to talk to your co-parent to try to settle. I always say, talk to the other person about settling first. And if you are a co-parent and there's a spouse, an ex-spouse or ex-partner who lost their job, be understanding because technically the court is likely, if it's more than 25%, going to reduce their child support. So why fight them and go to court and spend attorney's fees when ultimately that is a fair material reason to change child support? Now, intent and why people get fired, all of these things are going to be taken into consideration. So, um, yeah, again, if you're working jobs and getting fired on purpose and doing things just so you can reduce your child support, the court can learn that evidence. And again, they can keep your child support the same. So on both sides of the coin, you don't want to intentionally take money from your child and when you're living a certain lifestyle. And essentially, again, going back to that first slide, when I said the purpose of child support is to have a child live like both parents live together. So if one parent is much wealthier than the other, it may not seem unfair to pour all of that money into another parent's home, but your child deserves to live kind of as good as you do. And that's kind of the view of child support. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's kind of where these concepts are from. So now we're going to talk about some important questions or things, not necessarily questions, but just things to think about. Um, and I'd say a lot of parents naturally may begin with how much, and How much will I pay? How much will I receive? How much is fair? And these are understandable questions, but they're often not the most helpful when you're thinking about your family. And I say that because you need to think about what matters with your family. Because again, when we're talking about like what are your child's expenses, and child support doesn't always cover like extracurricular activities. If your child does have an extraordinary medical expense, that can be considered in back in the when I was discussing some of the things that the child support calculator factors in. One of them was child care, health care. So whatever parent pays for health insurance will get credit on their side of the worksheet for health insurance. Whichever parent pays child care, excuse me, they will get credit on their side of the child support worksheet. So you need to look at your family, your structure, and understand what makes sense. And if your child is going to be engaged in activities or they're going to go to private school, for example, some of these things are considered a privilege. So just because you want that for your child doesn't always mean the other parent has to pay for it. Now, if you're married and you both made decisions for a long time for your kid, it's likely the court will agree that those things need to consider because that's kind of the lifestyle you set up. What if all of a sudden your child was in public school for a long time and now all of a sudden there's this expensive school that the other parent, now that they're no longer with this parent, wants the child, wants the other child parent to pay for the child to go to, there has to be a best interest reason. And so there are can be arguments made as to why that's not financially reasonable. Even so, you can always make arguments back and forth about specifics on a case by case basis. But also, if you want, again, going back to the extracurricular activities, those are privileges. So sometimes the court will not order that other parent pay that if there's a set amount based on those basic expenses that I mentioned before. But others will agree that, hey, your child's been doing this since they were 3 years old. So there's no point in stopping. I'll throw out there swimming. They're very good. And so, yes, you should pay 50% of that. Or if you're paying, one parent's paying 70% of the child support amount, the other parent's paying 30%, then they may balance it that way. So the structure of your family, if there's other kids in the home, then you have that multi adjustment. So you need to think about that when you're talking about settling a case and making sure people have the standard of living and things like that. So always be thinking about what makes sense. If there's changes, be open to listen to them. Having that clear schedule, clear expectations, and complete financial information. If things change over the years, be open, be transparent, talk about it with your co-parent. If not, yes, you can utilize the court system. Yes, you can use the Office of Child Support Enforcement, but that's not going to bring any peace in your home or in your life, and definitely not to your child. If your kids can sense when there's stress in the family. So I always say that there is hope. You just sometimes have to have more of an open mind. And the goal should not be endless fighting over a child for the 18 years that they're in your home. The goal is to create a workable plan that supports your child. And then for those parents who are paying into another home, you just have to understand that your child should have the ability to live almost as good as you do. So there shouldn't be as much animosity if you feel like the other parent, and there is no system to checks and balances to make sure that this other parent is using all of the money us just on the child. So that's a big argument that comes in off and on. If they're misusing or misappropriating on a regular basis and your child's needs are not being met, then that's a whole different conversation. And we can get into that when it comes to custody itself. But overall, there is no specific checks and balances on some of the money because we're going to be looking at just making sure this person has a roof over their head, food. You can't always quantify that exact amount. There's a base amount of about 1,200 that they kind of utilize as what a child should, the cost of a child should be when we're looking at monthly. So, with that being said, now we're reaching the close to the end of the conversation. I did promise that I would answer some questions. So I want you to look at the screen because again, this is being recorded, but I'll go to some of the questions that were pre-submitted first. So someone asked me, can two parents unintentionally create future child support problems by agreeing to a parenting schedule that does not reflect what they really do? So that is a really good question, and I'd say yes. So there are parents sometimes that will say, "Oh, I'll just agree to joint custody, and because I don't want to fight in court, and I just." But in actuality, and so obviously, if they agree to joint custody, then their child support amount will reflect that. If there's this assumption that there's more than 92 overnights a year, but if in actuality you get out of court and one parent is actually taking care of the child, let's say 150 days. Well, actually, the number's not going to be exact, but the other parent is not getting nearly 92 overnights a year. So that just means the parent who is with more, the child more, is spending more, right? Yearly, and it's not being reflected in the child support payment. So yes, you can end up unintentionally creating a tension between the parties because this other parent is now spending more. So if you end up in a situation like that, the parent who is not meeting that threshold, they need to be mindful and possibly aware that they probably need to put more money into that household. And if they ask for things that outside of that child support, be fair, think about it, and just know that if they do take you back to court, it's very likely you'll lose joint custody potentially. And so you're gonna have to end up paying child support, more child support. So that is something to think about. So good question. Another question that was submitted was if a more detailed parenting plan reduces the chances of going back to court. I say not always, because with child support, again, it's more the finances. So there are two separate things. I'm mentioning the custody just because in divorce cases, you're often negotiating custody, but for child support alone, um, it's really a numbers game. So if your I do think the details about expenses such as like extracurricular activities, what happens if insurance doesn't cover a healthcare expense that the child has that comes out of pocket, those things are important to detail. So in that sense, yes, but you don't want to be so rigid, but absolutely think about things that you don't expect. Maybe have a meeting every 3 years and go over finances. And yes, this is your co-parent. This is someone that you're going to have to talk about finances with, even if it's not as a married couple. At least the basics, it might be tax returns, just to make sure that you're fair with the child support, and maybe that could be every 3 year thing. So these are things you can do in your own life to co-parent more effectively and ease the tension and utilize and using courts. And if you want to come to a lawyer to mediate, a mediator, or just have lawyers talk about this and help you through, that's also a wise way to go about it so you can have more information to know how to negotiate. You don't have to jump to a court filing every time something happens, and I think people have sometimes have that knee-jerk reaction. Another question was, how should parents think about fairness? So that's hard. A parent may feel the outcome is not fair if they're paying more and their expenses seem high, because a lot of us live above our means. So you do have to think about this heavily when it comes to how your lifestyle is when you have to pay child support. That's just the nature of it. There is priorities, and this is going to be one of those higher priority things. But these are my social media handles, 50 Shades of Law, and my website is clwilliamslaw.com. So again, I welcome anyone who has a personalized question or needs advice. You can always give our office a call, but it's always best to get advice from a lawyer so you truly know if you're going to do the right thing for your case and your family. All right. I want to thank you again. Take care.